Hello, and welcome to In the Roud. Greetings and salutations, dear listeners. My name is Matt Quinn, and this is In the Roud, a folk song podcast. I'll be your host to guide you through the world of traditional folk song as we go through the Roud Index, one song at a time. Each episode will feature two guests, one providing an historical look at the song, while the other will be a singer from the folk music scene to talk about their own version of the song. Way back at the very beginning of this podcast, I recorded an interview with Steve Roud, where he explained a little about the index, so please head back to that introduction episode if you're unsure what the Roud Index is. We're now in the second half of Season 2, and this is Episode 8. This week's song is Roud 18, called Bruton Town. Later on, we'll hear from singer James Patterson, but for now, let's take a look at the history of Bruton Town with regular In the Roud contributor Steve Gardham. Hello, Steve Gardham again.
Hello, Matt. Good to see you again.
Thank you. You also. It's been only a mere 2 weeks since we last heard from you, but then it had been, most of that season and last season since we heard from you, so it's we're getting double Steve Gardham in this short space of time. How are you at the moment?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. Yeah, life is hectic at the moment with various things happening backwards and forwards to London and various other places, but yeah, keeps him busy.
Where do you live then? I can't remember where you live. Hull, so back and forth to London, it's actually quite a stretch.
Yeah.
I thought if you lived in like Stevenage, that's not actually too bad. But you're in Hull, so actually that's a fair old whack.
Both my sons and my grandsons live in London, so yeah, back and forwards.
Very good, very good. Yes, pretty hectic for me as well. Since we're season 2 of this and the Patreon is up and running, so I'm producing 2 episodes a week rather than one when a season of the podcast is running, and then one a week when there's no podcast running. So,
well, you're doing a grand job.
Thank you. Yes, so it seems to be going very well so far, and I'm enjoying it, which is the key.
Good. Yeah, absolutely.
Otherwise, I wouldn't want to be doing it. Anyway, we've got a excellent little song. I said little, I don't know, but an excellent song to look at today. Roud 18, Bruton Town is one of the titles, and that's what we're going with for now. Start us off as usual. Give us the plot of the song. What's the story? What happens in this song?
Well, you've got a merchant in the Bristol area. I say the Bristol area because there are various different places where it's set. But if we say in the Bristol area, you've got the merchant with his 2 sons and a daughter fair, usual sort of start. And they have a factor or a servant who is a businessman who goes abroad and does their trading and comes back to the port, which might be Bruton or it might be Bridgewater. Actually, it's Bridgewater mainly. So he comes, he does all that and starts courting in secret the daughter. They fall in love. She loves him and he loves her. And then the brothers sort of get whisper of this and decide they're not having any of that. They're not having this servant come along and inherit their parents' wealth. And so they decide to do away with him between the two of them. They offer to take him out hunting with them. And when they've gone out hunting, they murder him. And they throw his body into a brake of briars, which is one of the motifs in the song, of course, and all bloody and gory in this brake of briars. And then we get the supernatural element, as far as I'm concerned, anyway, supernatural, where the daughter, the girl, she has a dream and sees the merchant, the lover, in the dream, and his body's all covered in gore. And so she sets off. She asks the brothers where he is when he doesn't come back with them before that. But and they just pass it on and say, "Oh, we don't know. He's run off somewhere." So anyway, she gets this dream, and so she goes off into wherever they went hunting, and she comes across his body and stays there weeping by the body for a long, long time. And then, as she gets hungry, she decides to come home and confront the two brothers. And from that point onwards in the story, it varies somewhat. In some versions, they decide to sail away themselves and get shipwrecked and drowned. In others, they are taken to court and tried and hung. So the ending sort of varies, but the brothers generally get their comeuppance. And that's about it, basically. Obviously, I'm sure everybody who's connected with the ballad knows that the story came directly from a version of Isabella and the Pot of Basil, without the Pot of Basil bit on the end.
Right. Okay. So we'll come to
Yeah.
that in a second. Um, was this then a particularly sort of widespread and popular song? I did a very brief check just now on the Roud index on the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library website. There's a bit where you can obviously search for titles or first lines or subject matter, and there is a bit where you can type in the Roud number and just brings up everything. And I typed in 18, and it came up with 154.
That's not a lot, really. It might sound like
Not a lot. I mean, I did type in Barbara Allen earlier, and it came up with almost 2,000 hits. But anyway, Bruton. So Roud 18, 154 hits on the Roud index.
yeah, and then each of those 154 is duplicated. So you're talking about 70 hits, really.
Right. Yeah. Sure. Of course.
Which is not a lot, and the majority of those are American as well. So if you take, say, you take that down to about 30, that's really not very many versions for a ballad like that. So it's widespread in the sense that it's spread into America, but it's not widespread, particularly in this country. It tends to survive mainly in the southern counties. I can't remember a version from tradition coming from the northern counties. I think it's, from the area where it was written, which is around the Bristol area.
Right. Sure. This certainly seems to be not massively sort of common and popular, but in terms of the folk revival and modern in quotes singers recording it, it does seem to get recorded quite a lot. It's very popular in that respect. But in terms of the traditional older stuff, it's less common. The people seem to sort of pounce upon it now.
There's no print. There's no broadsides survived. I think there must have been some, but there was no print survived. We'll come back to that later. But there is actually a late American broadside printed by Wehrman, uh, sort of New York in about 1900. So, and that's obviously from oral tradition. But that's the only actual broadside that is there. There aren't any, like with most other ballads, from the 17th century, 18th century. But I'll talk about that more when we get to it.
Sure. So as far as this being international, it's kind of just England and America.
Yeah, yeah, I'm pretty sure. I don't remember any Australian versions or Canadian versions. I think it's just the States where very, quite common, and Southern England.
Yeah. Nothing in Ireland than
Not that I
Ireland.
know of. No, I don't think so.
No. Okay, fine. Grand. Okay, well, you hinted at it just now. How far back can we trace this song? Where does it go back to in history?
Well, again, America. There's a little anecdote of my own sort of history in researching the ballad. When I first came across the ballad, obviously hearing the Martin Carthy version from the sharp Somerset version in Bruton town, and then I started from that point, looked up the other British versions and found them quite short. And then I had a copy of Gardner and Chickering, what state is Chicago in Illinois? The Yeah, there's the Chicago book by Gardner and Chickering, and there's a very long version in there, much longer than any English versions. And this led me to sort of think, and then I came across other longer American versions, and I wondered at the time, by then I'd found out that the earlier versions have Bridgewater. It's not Bruton, which is about a few miles away from Bruton, with Bridgewater, both quite close to Bristol as it happens. So you've got it was a the earliest ones are the Bridgewater merchants, and I looked up nearly every American state in the sort of eastern half of America has a Bridgewater, has a town called Bridgewater. And I wondered if it was because of all the American versions being so much longer. I actually wondered at the time, you might think this is a silly notion, but I actually wondered if it was an American ballad. You know, it had originated in America because the earliest versions come from America, certainly. The longest and earliest version itself is from I've got the book here, in fact, from the Stevens Douglas manuscript of Western New York, 1841 to 1856, edited by Harold W. Thompson. And that has, I just turned the page over, 22 verses. And it tells the story in full, in fact, uh, or as far as the ballad goes, anyway. Yeah, so that is the actual oldest and fullest version. The next one in line from that down is the Gardner and Chickering version from let me get the right state. Gardner and Chickering, here we are, Michigan, Southern Michigan, Ballads of Southern Michigan. And that's about sort of 6 verses less than the 22 in the manuscript version. So that led me to think of that, and then I did some more delving and researching and things, and decided that was a silly idea. And obviously, we got why. Well, let's have a look at its origins and where it actually came from. As we've said, it's the Isabella and the Pot of Basil, and it actually, if this is all on my article in Mustrad on the murdered servantman there. All of this is in there for anybody who wants to follow it up in more detail. Yeah, yeah, okay. Well, the if you look at that version, that longest version, and then there is a broadside, a 17th century broadside of Isabella and the Pot and Basil, the from direct from Boccaccio's Decameron, 13th century, is it? 14th century. If you look at the version, the broadside version of that, printed in the 17th century, late 17th century, in black letter, it's you can almost match it word for word with the earliest version, the Douglas, the Stevens Douglas manuscript. You can see how the ballad has been put together using either that particular broadside or one very much like it. So you can actually see the process of the ballad maker taking the information from Isabella and the Pot of Basil. Oh, he didn't go for the really far-fetched stuff like hiding the severed head in the pot of basil. That was all left out. But the rest of the story is just about verbatim what is in on the broadside. So when did it originate? How did it originate? Where did it originate? I have my theories on that, and I have some proof to back it up, but it's fairly circumstantial proof. I think I'll tell you why, but I'll put my theory forward first. I think it was printed in Bristol, which is only 20 miles away from Bridgewater. And I think it was set in Bridgewater, particularly because it's a negative ballad. It's about murder. It's a horrible ballad. And I have this theory that the people in the towns who wrote these ballads if it was a negative subject, so like a rape or a murder or something like that was involved, rather than set it in the place where it was written, they would set it somewhere a little bit further away so it didn't upset anybody and it still sold well in the town where it was printed. You can see that in several other ballads, actually, that have been written in the towns. So I think it was printed in Bristol, particularly, and I've got a good reason for that, and I'll tell you that in a minute. Um, and I think probably about 1750. I don't think it's necessarily any earlier than 1750. Now, what proof can we have of that? Well, as I say, it's quite circumstantial. Although we haven't got a copy, obviously, but what we do have is another ballad printed early in the 18th century in Bristol and in London as well, called the Bristol Garland. I've got a copy here in front of me. It's from the Robert White collection in Newcastle. Um, and it says, the Bristol Garland, how two brothers to prevent marriage between their sister and their prentice, so that's exactly the same subject, agreed with the captain to carry him to sea, that's a difference, and make away with him, which he promised to do. And that's a fairly common common theme to some of these ballads of that period. Uh, and what it does, most of it's in four parts actually. So it probably is a bit longer. It is a bit longer than the 22 verses in the manuscript version. But it starts with just listen to this first verse. In Bristol fair city, an old squire lived there. He had two sons and a daughter bright and fair. This father he died, as it will appear, and left them possessed of 1,000 a year. Those first two lines are almost verbatim, the first two lines of some versions of the Bridgewater Merchants. And then if we jump to the fourth verse, two Virginia merchants these brothers were, and they had a prentice who, as I understand, their sister loved so well in marriage to join, at which thing the merchants were disturbed in mind. Again, same idea completely. They said nothing to her, which again is a line from uh, the Bridgewater Merchant. Their minds to content to cut this young man off away did invent. And from that point onwards in the ballad, it's all about them bribing the sea captain to take him away to sea and all that sort of thing. So the story's different from that point on. But that makes me not only believe that our ballad was printed in Bristol, probably by the same printer. It was probably written by the same ballad writer.
Okay, he's reusing ideas.
Or at least one inspired the other. This would be too much of a coincidence. There are too many connections there for it to be a coincidence. So at the very least, one inspired the other, and both printed in Bristol, as far as I'm concerned. So that's basically how it originated, I think. Anyway, that's my theory. I do emphasize it's a theory.
It's a theory. That's fine. So just going back slightly, the broadside you said of this was, beg your pardon, my brain's going to be here. Did you say that was 1841 to 1856?
The manuscript is dated 1841 to 1856.
Right. Okay. I was just wondering if the broadside that you have for that one has one of those uh, um, comprehensive titles that tells you the whole plot of the song and goes on almost half as long as the
Just,
song itself.
in fact, I didn't read that out because it's not that relevant, but there's actually, after that sort of main title there, it actually gives a synopsis of part one, part two, part three, and part four. So the Bristol Garland in four parts, and then you get part one, how two brothers to prevent marriage between their sister and their apprentice agreed with the captain to carry him to sea and make away with him, which he promised to do. And then it's part two, part three, part four.
The standard kind of broadside titles that give you the whole plot.
Yeah, from a songster or a chapbook from middle of the 18th century, perhaps a bit earlier.
Yeah. So where does it go from there?
Um, Well, that's it. There may have been other broadsides that we could say that about any broadside song or any song that hasn't got a broadside. We can say, there probably was a broadside. Like, for instance, to give you an example, the Tailor's Breeches. There's no known broadside of that, but it's pretty certain that there probably was somewhere along the line. Um, any ballad, any sort of ballad form song, probably originated on broadside, and so it's quite possible that long 22 verse, or probably maybe even had more verses than that in the original. Those 22 verses were broken down to say 12 verses on another Bristol sort of 1820s broadside or something like that. That hasn't survived. Those are all quite strong possibilities. But then into oral tradition. So what makes me think that is perhaps the Bristol printed broadside was carried either by oral tradition or the actual broadside itself to America, and then went into oral tradition in that way. Bristol, of course, had a lot of connections with America. It was one of the main ports for sailing across the Atlantic.
So yeah, there are variations certainly in terms of I was aware of an American version of this that was on my list of things to potentially learn with one of my performing outfits, if you understand the expression, and that I heard from the singing of Sarah Gray, fantastic American singer Sarah Gray, um, and that version was called. Oh, just looking it back up again. That version was called The Jealous Brothers, I think, and
I haven't got an oral. Oh, yes, I have the Jealous Brothers from the Wolf Collection, 1962.
yeah, I just think I was just looking at the her sleeve notes to say where she got it from. Um, how she said Howie Mitchell from Virginia learned this ballad from Dr. Asher Treat, who collected it in Fayetteville, Arkansas in 1939. So I don't know where they got that, but nevertheless, that version, because I had the words up here. As you were describing the plot of Bruton Town, I was and the earliest versions, I was following along with the words of the Jealous Brothers to see what plot was the same, and the plot of this only it's basically the brothers straight away. Verse two, the brothers take the young man hunting, and they rode all over the hills and valleys to places where that they were known until they came to a lonesome valley. That's where they killed him and left him alone. And then they come back. The sister asks, "Oh, then right." So then the sister asks where the servant is, but the servant's never mentioned. It's never mentioned earlier than that he's a servant. It's just they take this young man out, and then he says the brothers say we lost him in a game of hunting, and then uh, she dreams the truth, as it were, that they killed him, and then she goes and finds him, and the sister comes back and says to the brothers, "You will be hanged. You will be hung." But it cuts off the sort of the establishing shots of the song, as it were.
I think the Wolf Collection's Arkansas. Uh, yeah,
Okay,
and
yeah, yeah,
I've got two versions from the Wolf Collection here, and they do start like you say, about a third of the way through the ballad, and
yeah. It starts with this one starts with they sat a court in one fine evening. The brothers hearing what they say, oh, it's this courtship. It must be ended, for the likes of this will never do. And then they rose up the early the next morning at a game of hunting for to go. Oh, it's this young man they both did flatter to go and hunt along with them.
that's right. Yeah, yeah.
And that's fantastic. But yeah, it's yeah, I think so. That's interesting in the sense that it gets rid of the setup and just dives straight into the plot.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole tradition. Uh, as sort of ballads evolve, they tend to sort of pare down to the essential details of the plot, and miss out anything that superfluous to go straight to the core of the story.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think yeah, so I guess then the locations, the what like Bridgewater or Bruton, I guess that's just I mean, that's one of those details, isn't it? That like that could just be mixed and matched depending on where you as a singer live.
Smithford Town, Seaport Town, Seabard Town, Portsmouth Town, Yonder Town. Yeah, these are all American variations. Yeah,
Yeah, because I know, but then I know that uh oh yeah, Cecil Sharp collected it a version called In Seaport Town. That was probably American though, one of Sharp's American journeys.
yeah, it is. Yeah, in Seaport Town. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, folk songs of the Southern Appalachians, Volume One. Yeah, and there's one in Volume Two as well, in Seaport Town. Different versions, but close, quite close.
I'm scrolling through the Roud Index here, looking at the entries for the book that you actually have a copy of, and in Seaport Town, and then yeah, Sharp's English folk songs, of the Southern Appalachians, is one where the first line is in Boston town there lived a merchant. Or maybe that might be. Occasionally there are misprints and typos in the Roud Index. We're not fallible. I know that in terms of revival singers, I'll talk to James later on about this, but I know Martin Simpson sang it a version called "The Bramble Briar."
Yeah, I've got quite a lot. There are quite a lot of versions called the Bramble Briar.
Oh, and that version was published in the Penguin Book of English Folk Songs. But then there are some, I think, yeah, America as well. There was one, certainly one or two. Oh yeah, Ballads and Songs of Missouri, 1904 book called The Bamboo Briars.
Yeah, yeah, I've got that one here in front of me. Yeah,
And you get the Bramble Briar and you get the Break of Briars sometimes, don't you, as well? Which I will mention briefly again later on.
yeah. There's quite a few called the Bamboo Briars and the Bomberry Briar as well.
North Carolina, the Ditch of
Yeah,
Briars.
but even in those, a lot of them still set it in Bridgewater.
Yes, of course. It's just that that's the titles that twist and change. But a lot of Bamboo Briars, the Bridgewater Merchant, Bruton Town, Cruel Brothers, Farmer's Daughter and Her Servant Man. That's an Alfred Williams manuscript version. It's of a brisk and gay old farmer. But certainly in America, it seems to be usually. I say that you may shoot this down straight away. The American ones, from what I've seen so far, tend to focus the title on the brothers rather than the murder itself.
Yeah, the Jealous Brothers certainly does crop up quite a lot. Yeah, the Two Lovers set Sparking, another Wolf title. The Hunt or the Cruel Brothers. Yeah,
Yeah, and then yes, a lot of folk songs are all about jealousy, aren't they? People being jealous of other people. Why does it? Maybe I'm just misremembering. The brothers kill the servant man.
yeah. It's a class thing, isn't it?
It's a class thing, but so I wonder why in some versions they're jealous.
Um, I think that's a sort of a bit of a misnomer, really. It's an assumption. In the fuller versions, I don't think the word jealous crops up. It's just this class thing. They don't want their daughter marrying a servant. It's as simple as that.
It makes sense with the Cruel Brothers, but Jealous Brothers, you get the Ozark Folk Songs book by Randolph has the Jealous Brothers.
Yeah, yeah. It's just a misunderstanding of the situation. It's probably one of those versions that doesn't have the. In fact, it is. It's the type where the title is the Jealous Brothers. There's no. That's the one. There's other versions that miss out the introductory verses. So whoever sort of gave it that title were misreading the whole ballad.
That's right. And I know one of our other regular contributors here and in the Round, Vic Gammon, wrote a bit about the song in the sleeve notes to an A.L. Lloyd album. And Vic mentions, I mean, I'm scrolling through, I'm not going to read this whole text out because it's quite long, but he mentions another song or the same song, I suppose, collected by Lucy Broadwood, which I've just found on the Roud Index. Lucy Ballwood manuscript. Mrs. Joyner of Chiswell Green. There we go.
Right at the top of my list, it was printed in the journal, in Journal 19.
Lord Burling's sister.
Yeah, it collected in Hertfordshire in 1914.
There we go. Do we know? Have we got? I mean, obviously the Broadwood manuscripts are in the Vaughan Williams Library. Do we know? Do we know how they compare to other versions?
Yeah, that is actually one of the longest English versions. It's got 3, 6, 9, 12 stanzas, or parts of 13 stanzas. One of them shunted together. Uh, and then the one collected in Hampshire, that one's got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 verses. And another one collected in Hampshire. I was in English Dance, so no, that's not got so many. But those are the longest. In fact, that probably is the longest English version. Is that Joiner version?
Right. Yeah. Vic Gammon said they Lloyd and Vaughan Williams published a different version of this song in the Penguin collection attributed to Mrs. Joyner of Chiswell Green, collected by Lucy Broadwood.
Yeah, they may be collated a version. I don't. I do a the Penguin version is. Oh yeah, no, it's. Ah yes, they've added a first verse in. That they've altered. They've altered the second verse and they've added an original first verse in, but other than that, it is Mrs. Joyner's version.
Yeah, Vic wrote they took the first two stanzas from. Oh yeah, Cecil Sharp recorded Mrs. Emma Overd in Langport in Somerset in 1904, and Vic wrote they, A.L. Lloyd and Vaughan Williams, took the first two stanzas from Mrs. Overd's version, as in quotes, Mrs. Joyner was unable to remember clearly the beginning of the ballad. No, and they reordered her verses that they did print. Joyner opens her incompletely remembered song with the line, Lord Burlington told his eldest brother, which perhaps links to the Burling Gap. And A.L. Lloyd's, because A.L. Lloyd's one is called The Bramble Briar, but his opening line is, In Burling Gap lived a rich merchant.
Oh, right, yeah. Another one of Bert's concoctions then.
Yes, we'll ask Brian Peters. Um, Brian's good at talking about A.L. Lloyd. But yeah, so that's because Burling Gap, maybe that has something to do with Lord Burlington then, as opposed to a location. You know,
Yeah, quite possibly. Mm.
this is this is all fascinating if you're interested in this sort of thing.
Yeah. The ballad does become crossed in an American version. Starts with our ballad, with the first verse of our ballad, and then goes into the ballad of William Hall. The rest of the ballad is all the ballad William Hall. That's collected in Mississippi. So we do get crossings with other ballads occasionally.
Yeah. Oh, and Vic also said a similar story is told in the song "The Constant Farmer's Son," which is Roud 675.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty obvious what's happened there. That is a rewrite. It's a later ballad. It only dates back to, I think, I haven't got it with me handy, but I'm pretty certain it only dates back to about 1830, and it's obviously a rewrite of the Bridgewater Cruel Brothers.
That's right. That's what Vic wrote. He said that, oh, because H.M. Belden, I think his name was, speculated that this song was made from the Bamblebriar. But in contrast, the Constant Farmer's Son does crop up quite a lot on broadsides.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So that's a can of worms. And we might get to that song in about 27, 28 years' time, maybe, or something. But anyway, that's interesting in itself. Yeah, as you said, there's a lot of America, and then some, yeah, Somerset basically in
Yeah,
Hampshire.
Somerset and Hampshire, uh, and Hertfordshire.
Could you just take a look at your list again? Where was the Strawberry Town one?
Somerset.
That's a Somerset one. Okay.
That's in again. That's the B version in Journal 19.
There obviously isn't or hasn't been, yeah, much to say about this because it is what it is since its sort of its earliest form and then its the slight um, whittling down to a more concise plot, and then even further in America with things like the Jealous Brothers when the establishing stuff goes down, but it's a lot of it kind of remains the same, and so there isn't, yeah, as there isn't really much to say about it. But with the recorded versions that I want to recommend, again, there aren't that many in terms of. I mean, it probably was there in the oral tradition, but of the people who were collected singing these old songs, this song hasn't turned up that often. But I mean, partly because the English ones there wasn't much in England and wherever, but in America as well, I've only really got three or four that I know of that are actual recordings of traditional
Yeah,
singers.
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, a lot of these collections are in private, in university collections, and they haven't been produced commercially. But there are plenty of them.
Right. Yeah, so I'll mention um someone who comes up in fact came up in last week's chat as well about the Three Butchers or whatever her version was called. Um Queen Caroline Hughes um was sang this song and was called The Break of Briars in that one. That's Peter that's a Peter Kennedy recording made in her caravan near Blandford in Dorset on the 19th of April 1968.
It's interesting as well that Alice Gillington uh, produced a book in about 1910, and she had a version in there called The Break of Briars, and that was collected in Hampshire, so not that far
Oh, okay.
away. And I would, I'm just trying to find Caroline Hughes's version now to compare it, but I would imagine it's probably got pretty much the same stanzas in it. Uh,
There were a farmer living near Bridgewater. He had two sons and one daughter
this one,
too. He feeled it fitting to plough the ocean, oh, to plough the ocean that raged so
yeah,
clear.
no, this hasn't got a first stanza. In fact, it starts quite late on in, like the American versions, the Gillington version, so it maybe isn't that closely related. I'm just trying to find Caroline Hughes's version at the moment, but I haven't got it. Oh, by the way, I've just spotted the Wayman version from. Oh, it's printed in 1890. The broadside printed in New York, and it does have a long. It has a lot of verses, so that obviously derives from either the original or the Gardner and Chickering version. In fact, it's pretty close. Just looking at the two now, it is almost got the same verses as the Gardner and Chickering version from Michigan. It's actually titled The Bramblebriar, but it's got 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 17 stanzas, so it's only a few short of the 22 of the earliest version. But that wasn't printed until 1890, obviously from oral tradition.
Right, yeah, sure. And so we can find the Queen Caroline Hughes recording from Peter Kennedy is on the CD I'm a Romany Rye.
I did this study probably 10, 15 years ago, and some of the later recordings are not included in it, so that needs adding in.
Yeah, yeah. So the I'm a Romany Rice CD is technically The Voice of the People, Volume 22. I've mentioned this in the past. The Voice of the People was a 20 CD set, and there are 10 further CDs, but they are not labeled with numbers. They have subtitles like I'm a Romany Rye songs of Southern English Gypsy traditional singers, but technically it's the 22nd Voice of the People collection, and that's a whole two discs of tracks of, yeah, as it says, Southern English Gypsy traditional singers, and the tracks have been selected by Shirley Collins from recordings made by Peter Kennedy and Bob Copper.
It's wonderful, magnificent.
It it really is. I tell you, the first disc is a lot of recordings of people like Phoebe Smith and Tom Willett and Charlie Scamp and Rebecca Penfold. But the second disc is a whole disc of Carolyn Hughes and her family. And on there, track 14 is The Break of Briars. What also exists but isn't, I think, included there is a recording of Carolyn Hughes's husband John Hughes singing "The Break of Briars." Peter Kennedy recorded him singing it, and he had three verses, which Carolyn didn't include in her recording, which apparently make the story more understandable.
So where do you get that from?
That's the sleeve notes of "I'm a Romany Rye."
Oh, right. So the recordings in Peter's collection, and we can't get it unless it's even if it's on the British Library website. That's been it's down at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, so yeah, John Hughes has three more verses, which I think are after Carolyn Hughes's verses. But anyway, so that's there and exists, which is the Carolyn Hughes one. The other three I wanted to mention are the three American ones I could track down. As a woman called Eliza Pace, and this recording is on another musical traditions label release, Mustrad as we call it. It's a CD called When Cecil Left the Mountains: Historic Recordings of Appalachian Singers and Musicians from 1927 to 1955. And the recording's not actually that good. It's a bit of a there's a lot of interference on the actual recording, and it's quite tricky to make it out. And then the Mike Yates wrote the sleeve notes for that one, and he does. As I was listening to it, I thought, I can't really figure out. I can't get a grasp of the melody of this. And then Mike Yates wrote, once Mrs. Pace settled into the song after the first two verses, so obviously she was having a bit of trouble with the first two verses, and then you get to verse three and you actually can, she's singing a definite melody after that.
Yeah, that sometimes happens, does that? Yeah, I've experienced that in my collecting.
Yeah, and so yes, Eliza Pace of Hyden in Leslie County, Kentucky. That's a there was a recording that she made to Cecil Sharp in October of 1917, but the version I think that's in the When Cecil Left the Mountains CD is the Alan Lomax collected recording in 1937. I'm not sure where the 1917 Cecil Sharp recording exists anymore or not, but there it is. Another American one I wanted to mention was Leisha, I think is how you pronounce it. Leisha, that's Lisha, Leisha or Leisha, probably Leisha. Leisha Shelton of Sodom, North Carolina, sang a song called In Zepo Town, Zepo.
So it's a mishearing of Seaport Town, isn't it?
Well, there we go, exactly. And John Cohen recorded her singing that in August of 1963. That recording is available on the 2005 Smithsonian Folkways CD called Dark Holler, which is a load of American song. It's a CD called Dark Holler, Old Love Songs and Ballads. And there's Elisha Shelton singing it and another song. And on there are other American singers, particularly ones that Brian Peters has mentioned a lot, Dillard Chandler among them. So must get my hands on those recordings. And then Hattie Presnell is a name that Brian Peters has mentioned a few times in relation to American versions of these songs. She was from Beach Mountain in North Carolina, and she had the Jealous Brothers, which was recorded from her in approximately 1961. And there's a Folk Legacy label album, The Traditional Music of Beach Mountain, North Carolina, Volume 1. And the recording of her, Hattie Presnell, singing it is there. Apparently, Hattie remembered more old ballads than any of her Beach Mountain contemporaries. But there we go. It's a shorter list of oral tradition recordings than sometimes we're used to on this podcast. Although I know that as we go on with some of these more less rather well-known child ballads, that there will be even fewer recordings than the four I've mentioned.
Yeah, you mentioned the Mustrad website, Musical Traditions. The article that I've got on there about the ballad. What I also did on there that might be of interest is I took the broadside version of Isabella and the Pot of Basil, and I wrote it out as a ballad using the earliest version of the ballad. So it's like a hybrid of using the actual names and facts from the Boccaccio version story, but setting it out as a ballad exactly the same as the Bramblebriar. So that's on there as well if anyone's interested and wants to have a look at that.
Great, yeah. So I'll, as I said, I'll put a link to that article, and there's always a link to the Mustrad website, I think, in the show notes. But I will put a direct link to that article in there as well, so people can track that straight away. Right, I think we'll finish there.
Oh, well, have a good time at your carols then.
Oh, that's right. We're recording this at in the early evening on a Wednesday, which means that I am now off to sing some loud Sheffield carols in the village of Dungworth, which is always a highlight of the year. Is this period for me?
I'll get back to my book. I've only got about three or four songs left now to write the notes to, and then it'll be ready for typing up then. Ready.
Well, there we go. Excellent. Yeah. So this is your last appearance in this season, but I'm sure we'll have you back in the future.
Send me the list for the next series, and I'll have a look.
I will do. I will do. But in the meantime, Steve Gardham, thank you very much.
Okie dokie. Thank you for having me. Cheers, Matt.
A huge thanks to Steve Gardham for providing us with the history of Bruton Town. We're now at the halfway point in the episode, so we'll just take a few minutes and listen to a few different versions of this song sung by traditional singers. Not many this week. What you're going to hear now are clips of The Break of Briars from Carolyn Hughes, The Cruel Brothers from Eliza Pace, and The Jealous Brothers from Hattie Presnell.
Oh, there were a farmer living near Bridgewater. Well, he had two sons and one daughter too. He found it fitting to plough the ocean. Oh, to plough the ocean that raged so clear. Our servant demands great to wed my sister. My sister, she have got mine to wed. They work on poor Chip, and their bloody is soon slaughtered. We'll send him to his asylum grave.
Near Bridgewater, a rich man lived, who had two sons and a daughter dear, whose life by death it was Arabian, and filled their children's hearts with care. These young men to the seated venture, to bring whatever was the game. He was a princess bound and strong and dented. They sent him factory over the main.
Late one evening, a couple sat talking. Two brothers were listening what was said, saying this courtship, it's got to be ended, or lay this young man in his grave, or lay this young man in his grave. Late that evening, it's talking of hunting. They insisted upon him to go. They kept on insisting upon him till at last he'd agreed to go.
And you can find the links to those tracks and the albums they're from, if they're from albums, in the show notes. On to the second half of the episode, I sat down with singer James Patterson to talk about his version of the song called The Murdered Servant Man. Well, hello and welcome to In the Roud, James Patterson. Hello.
Hello.
Hello, so good to see you. How are you? How are you doing?
I'm very well, thanks. Yeah, feeling good. Just coming off the back of 4 gigs, unusually.
Oh wow, was that 4 in a row? Was that a little tour?
4 in a week, which was
That-
with John Dipper, and it's been very nice.
Ah.
Very nice. Unusual these days, but nice.
Indeed. By the time this episode goes out, I will have been on tour for a weekend, but I'm at the time of recording, next weekend, I'm going on tour for 3 gigs in 3 days. So it's always nice to do that sort of thing, do a little run of gigs. It really gets you on top of the material.
It does. It's nice. By the time you get to the end, it's all running very smoothly.
Yeah, and you kind of wish you could do the first gig again, with but feeling like you do at the end when you're really on top of things.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's the way it is.
That's like when it's the thing that most people do is when you get a lot of new material together, you record the album and then you tour it. Where actually, I quite like to record the album after I've toured it, so that the songs are more played in.
Oh, absolutely.
But it
Yeah,
doesn't work like that a lot of the time because you have to have something on the tour to sell, and therefore you need the album first. So
yeah. Well, yeah.
depends how.
Never been that pressure in my life, happily.
Fair enough. Um, yeah, so yeah, it's great to have you on. I was very excited that you said yes to this.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, I've known. I can't actually say for certain whether we've actually met before in real life, but we've certainly been in the same room a lot over the years at folk festivals and folk clubs and things. But I'm not entirely certain whether we've ever actually spoken to each other before this.
Uh, no, possibly not. Possibly not. Hey, but we're putting that right
We're
now.
putting that right now, indeed. Indeed. So, yeah. So, we're here to talk about Round 18, Bruton Town. But before we come to that, tell us a bit about yourself and your sort of your history with folk music. I mean, in your history of music in general, were you a musical child or not? And your musical upbringing and your folk music. Did you like did folk music find you, or did you find folk music? What's the story, James Patterson?
Right. Okay. Um, well, like many middle class children from the 1950s, I was made at the age of about 7 or 8 to sit down and suffer piano lessons, um, which I absolutely hated. And
I can see a piano just off to your right there in the room.
yeah,
In the room.
yeah, I know. And
Do you still hate
it,
it?
it's one of, well, I wouldn't have bought a piano if I did. I still can't play it, or not satisfactorily. It's one of the big regrets in my life, as my dear late mother told me it would be. That I should have stuck with it, but I didn't stick with it. And at the age of 13, I think I asked my parents for a guitar for my birthday, and my first guitar was a Tatra Classic, for 13 guineas or whatever it cost at the time. I had a very good friend through my teenage years who was quite a good guitarist, and he taught me the basics. My musical taste at that point, and through my school years, was always more on the acoustic side of things. So I was more inclined to listen to Dylan and Donovan and um, Leonard Cohen and people like that, rather than listen to Cream and Hendrix. And I took a bit of stick for that. It's not very fashionable to be listening to the sorts of things that I was listening to. Um, I think I did probably make a couple of brief appearances in school concerts. Certainly, I remember playing some incredible string band songs at a concert on one occasion. I was a big fan of the Incredible String Band. And also an Irish chap called Jonathan Kelly. I had an album of his called Twice Around the Houses, and I sang quite a lot of songs from that at one point. I won a competition in Austria when I was on a school skiing trip. I was persuaded to enter a talent show, which I won.
Oh, congratulations!
But it was really, I suppose, in a formal sense, my my introduction to the folk scene was when I was a student. I was doing a degree in South London, and I was at a girlfriend's home one afternoon, a Sunday, if I recall, and we didn't know what we were going to do that evening. And her father said, well, looking at a copy of Time Out, he said there's a folk club in Forest Hill that tonight they've got a chap called Dick Gogan. So I went to see Dick Gogan and was completely blown away. I mean, that was a kind of complete revelation moment. I had, by that stage, I mean, I was aware of Fairport Convention and Steel Eye Span, and I had an album called Songs of a Changing World. I don't know why I purchased it, but that had John Raven and Nick Jones and Tony Rose singing industrial folk songs on it.
Oh yes, I think I've got a copy of that LP myself.
Yeah, I've still got one down here somewhere.
Yeah.
But seeing Dick Gocken was a kind of it was a kind of turn the light on experience for me, and I went with that girlfriend. I'd stayed with her, I suppose, for a few months. During which time we actually decided to start a folk club. It ran for 5 or 6 weeks only before we ran out of money. In South London, in Wandsworth. Had some great guests. I remember June Tabor and Chris Foster appearing in that period, and
Wow.
And we also had a comedian. I can't remember who. But anyway, it's a digression. But I went every week to the Bird in Hand in Forest Hill. After a short while of going regularly, I met and became friendly with a chap who always sat at the same table at the front, and I joined him at that table, and he kind of encouraged me to learn things for floor spots and things, and he was Nick Dow.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, great.
So Nick and I did a lot of things together, and it was there one night that I saw a band doing a floor spot. They were called Fingers Galore,
Okay.
and they were okay. But their lead singer was very weak as a singer, I thought.
Right.
And at half time at the bar, I said to them, nice set chaps, but you really could do with a singer. And it turned out that it was their last ever floor spot, because one was going off to Australia and 2 others had decided to give it a miss or something. And the guy who had been the lead singer was Ralph Jordan.
Oh,
and
yeah.
We got together initially, as I recall, 3 of Fingers Galore and myself had a single rehearsal, and then we were down to 3, and we stayed as a 3-piece, and we called ourselves Silas. And we stayed as a 3-piece for a while, and then there was a hiatus, and we went down to a duo, and Ralph and I worked as a duo Ralph and I continued working as a duo off and on from then. That was 1974 or perhaps early 75,
Right.
through until we were joined by John Dipper, which was in 2000.
When he was a young shaver.
Yeah, he was. He was just a student still at the time in Cambridge. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Ralph and I, in the meanwhile, got together with Mick Ryan and John Burge, who were quite a well-known and respected duo.
Oh, yeah, we had a mention of Mick Ryan and John Burge a few weeks ago on the podcast. I think, forgive me for listeners for forgetting which episode, one of our singing guests recommended a version of a song we covered in this season by Mick Ryan and John Burge. I can't remember which one it was.
No, it'll be on. I mean, I think they only released one album, which was called Fair Was the City, which was actually a misremembered Fair Worcester City. It should have been. But Mick always sang Fair Was the City and Fair Was the Show. I think that was the beginning of a song called The Cruel Ship's Carpenter.
Oh, well, there you go. We had, and that's it then, because
That's it.
three,
That right.
3 weeks
Okay.
ago was Route 15, The Cruel Ship's Carpenter, and
Right, okay.
so it was Andy Turner was the singing guest for that, so it was him that recommended.
So Ralph and I and Mick and John got together. We decided to call ourselves Crows. That was a very early decision on Mick's part. Mick and John were living in Harrogate at the time. Ralph and I were both in London. So much time was spent in Morris Thousands going up and down the M1 for rehearsals. The first iteration of Crows, though there were some personnel changes along the way, lasted from 1978 until 1986, I think. And I was with Crows all that time until late 1985 when I had we did a gig. No, we did a gig on May the 1st. This was the final straw, really, for me. I mean, I was working, obviously, full time. I was a film archivist at the British Film Institute. And I was also dancing with the Herger Morris, and had been for some years. It was May the 1st. We danced the dawn as we always did. So I was up at about 4 o'clock in the morning and dancing in North London, in Stanmore, in Middlesex, I suppose. And I had a gig at the Coppers Club in Rottingdean with the band that night. And I drove off the road on my way home. I fell asleep at the wheel. Didn't hit anything, but I woke up doing about 60 across a wide grass verge. And I had two small children at the time, and I decided that I really had to stop this business of doing gigs. We'd done a few, one-off in Hull after working in London all day, that sort of thing, and it was getting a bit silly. So I decided that I was going to stop, and Ralph and I continued for a while, and then Ralph joined the Fraser sisters and became a Fraser sister for a while, and he went off and
So
did
he
that.
did. Yes, I'd forgotten about that. That's excellent.
I mean, he'd already been with Eric and various other people. He'd left Crows a bit earlier.
Oh yes,
Um,
Eric. That was
and
that was him with Nigel Chippendale and Colin Thompson. Was that his name? That I might.
yeah, I
Yeah,
think so.
Colin
Yeah,
Thompson.
that's right.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Good band.
and at that point, Ralph had been replaced in Crows by Jim Younger. Um, and oh, and I at that point I got into Irish traditional music very strongly, but I wasn't playing publicly very much at that time. There was a gap of 5 or 6 years um, when I became obsessively interested in an endurance sport, which we'll draw a discreet veil over because that's not to do with this.
Okay.
And
Okay.
and then in about 1990, Ralph and I got back together again, um, and we didn't do sort of club and festival work. We did quite a lot of odd bookings, which Ralph generally procured through his contacts at the BBC where he worked.
Of course, yeah.
I remember playing in Andy Kershaw's garden for a garden party for him and that sort of thing. Which those were the sorts of things we were doing, and we at the same time we were um, we were recording what was going to be a duo album. I still have the work that we did. I mean, none of it had reached a finished version, but there's quite a lot of the beginnings of a Silas album, which I have, which was being recorded on Sunday afternoons at the BBC's Maida Vale studios, which Ralph would book as a training session and bring in some junior engineer to work for us, and so we did quite a lot of work towards that at that point. And then at Whitby in 2000, Ralph met John, John joined us, and we became Patterson Jordan Dipper. Worked through from then until about 2007 when Ralph's alcoholism, I think, got the better of him for a while,
That's right.
and John and I continued, and that's what we've been doing since, and still do when we can. I mean, it's not convenient. I live up here in Leicestershire. John's in Salisbury, and John has two small children. He's also spent some time in Canada in that period, and so but we still work. As I say, we're planning, and at the moment we're talking about recording a new album at the early part of next year.
Oh,
So
excellent.
whether we do or not, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But we're certainly talking about doing that.
Fantastic. Yeah, I remember, because I don't think I've actually seen you two play as a duo ever, but apart from, I haven't seen any of your gigs like in recent memory, but I did see, because I was there and we spoke about this briefly before we started recording, that you both were there and played one of your Patterson Jordan Dipper tracks at Ralph Jordan's funeral back in the early half of 2014. So it's been over 10 years now, which is a startling thought. But that was a very sad time. But yeah, okay, so yeah, great, fantastic. Yeah, I like it. I like it when people can pinpoint like days or dates of when they first heard folk music. Like you said, it was a Sunday. So I would like that sort of because Andy Turner gave me the exact date and time that he heard, and it was because that's when Steel Eye Span were performing All Around My Hat on Top of the Pops, and he found the date that was on, so he can pinpoint exactly to the day. And he said it would have been 7:37 on Friday the what's it of 1970. I don't know what it was, but it was quite.
Yeah. No, I can still close my eyes and picture the bird in hand the night that I saw Dick Gaughan.
Wow, fantastic.
Yeah, it was a remarkable experience.
I'm sure. A remarkable man, remarkable performer. So then, Bruton Town, Roud 18. Do you have a recollection of not necessarily the version that you sing now and that we're here to talk about, but do you have a memory of when this song in any form sort of came into your consciousness, when you were first aware of this song?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I remember is this version, and it was the recording. Well, I probably saw him do it live as well, but it was the recording by Tony Rose in the album On Banks of Green Willow. That's where I remember it from. Though, as I said to you earlier, I do have a copy of the Pentangle album, Pentangle, and there is a version of Bruton Town on there, but it's not the same tune. And I think really what really attracted me and still attracts me to this particular song is the tune.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fantastic melody.
And the fact that it's 5/4, which is unusual for folk song.
Yeah, it's not as common, but there are some really good 5/4 melodies out there.
Yeah, I like 5/4, and I have taken things which aren't in 5/4 and put them in 5/4. So John and I recorded a version of Rary's Hill, which I put into 5/4. And though never performed publicly, I don't know if you know the song, which was recorded by Andy Irvine and others, probably called When the Boys Are on Parade.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a 5/4 version of that as well.
Looking at Rary's Hill, that's Roud 6,847. I will never get to cover that on this podcast.
It's a shame because I'm looking forward to talking to you about it.
Well, I will make sure that you get to come on as a guest on our Patreon then, because on the Patreon, I've said this before.
You're working backwards.
Well, no, because Steve Roud has added 300 more to the Roud Index in the last 2 months. So I'll never be able to start at the end, but I've said this a lot to listeners, so they probably know this stuff, but I've run the numbers, and I'm currently doing 3 seasons a year of this podcast, and that's 30 songs a year. And so if I've run the numbers, and if I do this for 40 years, I will reach Roud 1200 out of 47,000. And so obviously on the main podcast sequentially I'll never get above, I might get above 1200 but not much and in the grand scheme of things. But on the Patreon side I'm I'm basically getting singer guests in to come and pick songs they want to talk about, and also covering carols and other Roud numbers. Basically, in numeric and from a numerical point of view, it's all relatively random, but there's logic to it from a choice and singer point of view. So at some point, we'll get you on the Patreon to do 2 or 3 episodes in a singer's choice mini season that we're doing, and yeah, we'll definitely have Rary's Hill there because that. Well, otherwise, we'll never get to cover 6,847. So
No.
that'll be marvelous. We'll come back to that at some point in the future. But yeah, 5/4. It's a really lovely time signature. I know Nancy Kerr is very, very keen on 5/4 melodies, and I know that previous guests of our podcast, Vic Gammon and Emily Portman, co-wrote an article for the Folk Music Journal on 5/4 in traditional song. So that there's a whole article out there if you want to read it.
I should
on that, which is fantastic. And yeah, it's just it's such a lovely sort of lilting, almost lolloping sort of. It's a very very gentle lollop, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it's very attractive.
And I think for a lot of people, when one mentions 5/4 time in folk song, the first thing that comes to mind is the song "Searching for Lambs." That's kind of the key text, I think, when it comes to 5/4.
Yeah.
You know, the da 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 da, which is also a very good minor melody. And yes, I sing a 5/4 thing that I recorded with George Sansom. It's the title track of our album, Sheffield Park, and that's got a 5/4 tune as well. The in Sheffield Park, oh there did dwell a brisk young lad, I know him well. He courted me, my heart to gain, but he's gone and left me full of pain. And then I changed it, and I then edited it to make it fit the words. He's gone and left me full of pain. It ended up being in 6/8 for a bar, just so the words would scan. But that's the beauty of it all.
We all do that.
It's self-editing, and yeah, it's sort of the scansion of the words dictated the time signature of that last bit. But yeah, 5/4 is not the most common, but it's a lot of people's favourite time signatures. You know, there is something very, very singable about a 5/4 melody. And with this one as well, with the Murdered Servant Man, your song's very good as well. So yeah, so in that case, yeah, my next question is always, where does your version start for you? And it obviously started with Tony Rose again.
Well, yeah, I mean, deep in my memory, really.
I mean, Tony Rose was fantastic. You know, absolutely. I mean, I never saw him live. There are some times I'm annoyed that I'm younger, beg your pardon, and one of those things is I never got to see people like Tony Rose live. You know, occasionally, you know, good fortune to see people like Nick Jones live because he came back and did some stuff, but people like Peter Bellamy and Tony Rose are people I just, you know, I'm too young.
Well, you will never, unfortunately. Yeah,
indeed, yeah. So it's one of the I'm very sad about that in a way, but we've got the albums.
Such is the world, you know.
Indeed, and we got the LPs, we got the albums, and they are wonderful.
Yeah. So as I was saying to you earlier, that's where it sat in my mind. I mean, was a memory of Tony Rose's version, and
also, sorry, as I talked about with Steve Gardham, that version stems from the Wanton Seed book, the Frank Purslow.
It does,
Wanton Seed book, as
absolutely.
Well.
And I have, like many people before, and probably subsequently have fairly significantly plundered Frank Perslow's collections of the Hammond and Gardner.
Yeah, actually, I'm pretty sure that Sheffield Park song I sing with George Sansom is in the Wanton Seed book. I'm pretty sure it's the same book a few pages down. Are you consulting it now?
I am.
Mine's back on my shelf behind me, so I can't grab it. But I think it should be under S.
Sheffield Park. There it is.
And that's the melody I just sang.
It is 5/4. Yeah, absolutely.
Except the ending, which I edited because it just stops in 5/4. He's gone and left me full of pain, and it just stops there. And I always felt like it like you came to the precipice of a cliff and it didn't go anywhere. So I extended it with a repeat of the last line in 6/8. But yeah, so there you go. It's the same book. So what a segue. What a
I know. And my copy has all the pages loose now. It's been used so much.
Yeah, mine's like that as well, I bet. But yeah, so the Wanton Seed book into Tony Rose, and
as I was saying, the thing which prompted me to go back to it was finding that tune used in a string quartet by Gustav Holst, which I have a recording of, and it wasn't something that I knew, but I tend to buy CDs of string quartets because it's a form that I'm very interested in, and I also collect recordings of music from English composers or British composers in the early part of the 20th century. So between those two things, I happen to land on this album called The English Fantasy, which is a lot of English composers at that time were writing what they called fantasy quartets or fantasy quintets or whatever, and this was one of them.
And so that brought you back to the song.
It did, yeah.
And was it then decision straight away to bring that to you and John as a duo?
No, we don't work quite like that. What tends to happen is that on the song side, these things kind of aren't discussed. I work on things. It's not. Because I'm always working on something new, and so I would have worked on that myself, and the base of the arrangement would have come from my working. And when I get to a point where it's more than just a kind of idea that we might do this particular song, then I will play it to John, and we will start working together on it from there if we decide that we're going to take that forward. Sometimes he just says no.
Yeah, I can hear John. I can hear John saying it in that way as well.
Not very often.
I've known John I've known John Dipper a long time, and I can hear that. Yeah, just hear the way he sometimes just says no.
No.
It's very good.
Well, that's fine.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I'm all for just being, when it comes to bands working out arrangements and stuff, I'm all for just being very frank about it and just saying, no, that doesn't appeal to me, and let's move on. I'm very quite thick-skinned in that way. It's like if you don't like what I've brought, or you don't think it's the right thing, just say, look, I don't think that's right, or that's not going to work. Let's move on to something else, and I'll go, okay, great.
In the end, it's why I left the reformed Crows. I had two and a bit glorious years. I really enjoyed being back with the band before the pandemic. But in the end, I just decided I didn't want to be doing stuff that we did in the 70s, and the new material that was coming forward didn't really do it for me. But and so I decided, thanks, chaps, it's been fun, and I'll step away at this point. So and they're still doing their thing, I think. So
yeah, they are. Yeah, they're
power to them.
Very good stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, but John Dipper didn't say no to this song. And
at that point we start working on an arrangement.
So what is the arrangement on this one?
It's It's guitar. It's guitar and viola d'amore, which is what everything is, because that's what we play.
Of course, because John, I mean, I've known him so long that I've known him since, as you have, since before you played the viola d'amore. But when, because my brain, he's just a fiddle player,
Yeah,
not just a fiddle player. That's slightly demeaning. He is an extremely good fiddle player. But then he started in the last, however many years playing the viola d'amore.
yeah. I think he wanted some. He wanted some extra um, facility. I think he wanted to be able to do more than he could do on the fiddle,
Yeah.
and the fact that he now has seven strings, melody strings, and he bought a Chinese um, viola d'amore just to see how it would work and to play around with tunings and things. Um, which he still has. He still has that. And then he commissioned a new one for himself, and then he bought a bigger one in Spain because they all have reciprocal strings underneath, which just ring. That's the point of them. So you have seven strings on the top.
Oh, you mean, sorry, sympathetic strings? I think
Sympathetic, yeah, and
yeah.
underneath you have sympathetic strings. So the Chinese one and the one that he commissioned are kind of classic viola d'amore, which have seven on top
Oh,
melody
blimey.
strings and seven sympathetics. But he now has a bigger. It's not technically a viola d'amore. I can't remember what it actually is called. But that has 25 sympathetic strings, I think. So it's a bit of a tuning nightmare. And just this last week, he's acquired another one, which I haven't seen yet. But I was there when he went into the house to pick it up.
Do you have to give extra long introductions then in your gigs in order to let him tune?
No, no,
Of
because the
course, yeah,
sympathetics he wouldn't
yeah.
try to change those. I don't think in a gig that would just be because that's kind of really fiddly. Um, I mean, sometimes he does have to tune up a bit. I mean, the bigger one has gut strings, and they can react in an odd way to changes in temperature and things. We all have to tune up a bit.
Yeah, and we all have that problem with string instruments. 'Cause I play the mandolin a lot, and it's and used to play the fiddle a lot as well, but the mandolin particularly now. And yeah, it's different room atmospheres from gig to gig will affect the instrument. And some gigs I don't have to do much tuning at all in a whole gig, and sometimes I'll have to like really, really retune it after every song almost. By the end of the song, it's gone a bit. It all depends.
Yeah, these things happen. But anyway, I mean, we worked on a guitar and viola arrangement, which would have been a development of the basics that I had taken up in the first place. And my idea is always to try and, I mean, I will play something for a long time, especially if I have learnt it um, uh, orally, and I do. I do read music, but I tend not to learn. I tend to learn things by listening to them, um, and then I have to work quite hard to try and move what I'm doing away from what I'm not interested. I'm not interested in trying to replicate somebody else's arrangement.
No, no, no. Very good. Yeah. Yeah, Vic Gammon a few weeks ago, I think it was, told this story about how that he certainly because he plays in a duo with Will Duke occasionally now, but he did that quite heavily when when Vic lived in Sussex, and for learning tunes from like books or manuscripts or whatever, Vic had this process where he'd record himself playing it, just sight reading it from the dots as best he could. He'd send that recording to Will Duke. Will would learn it from the recording, and then Will would teach it to Vic. And so Vic would learn it orally, but in a sort of circuitous route. And and yeah, and
Yeah,
then once he played a tune like that with Will Duke in a session or something, and someone came up to Vic and said, That's not how it's written down in your book." And Vic said, "No, I'm sure it's not. That's absolutely fine. I've learned it differently now."
Yeah, I know. But these things move. I mean, that's the great joy of folk song is that because I mean, though they are written down, of course. I mean, I've always seen what's written down as a starting point, not it's not a something which is set in stone.
That's right. And when it comes to it's a different, it's a side of the folk sort of thing we're looking at in this podcast is tunes. I mean, we're doing song melodies, tunes, but not tunes as in folk tunes that you play in a tune session.
Yeah, yeah.
With that sort of thing, if you get the dots written down in a book or something, that's really just the skeleton of the tune. The notes tell you what the notes are, but so much of a tune is whether there's ornamentation you might want to put in, or what I've always been told. This is back to the Fraser sisters. Fee Fraser once told me that the gaps between the notes are more important than the notes, because the notes give it, you know, what notes to play, but the gaps between the notes is how you make the tune. It's how the tune sounds.
And also the timing. I mean, yes, it'll give you sort of crotchets and minims and whatever written down, but actually the timing of the way that you deliver the song, the way that you deliver that tune with the words. And for me, I mean, I am well known for singing behind the accompaniment, if you know what I mean. So, and it's, I think people who haven't worked with me in the past find it very difficult because sometimes you'll get sort of almost quarter of a way through the instrumental arrangement of a line of a song, and I will start singing at that point. And Mick used to sort of say, and with one bound he is free, when finally I seem to arrive in the right place at the end, and it doesn't seem like it's going to work. It's just the way I do things. It seems right to me. And I think even now, John, we were working on a new song last week, and he asked me to record it just singing the tune, so that he could write it, so that he could work a viola part to go with it, because in the end we think the arrangement of this will be just voice and viola. And he couldn't do it until he gave me a click track and said, I want you to sing each note to this tune on this click track. Absolutely. Because then I'll be able to work out how to play it, and then I'll sing it, and it'll probably clash horribly in places, and we'll have to work on that. But that so yeah. I mean, I think you're right. Going back to it, I mean, how you interpret the tune and how you deliver the tune is absolutely not how it's written down. It would sound like Sibelius playing it on a computer if you did that, I think.
Exactly, yeah. And the same applies to songs, really. It's, yeah, the words and melody are there, but what is different, what makes it different, and why there is such a vast wealth of variation in this world of folk songs is it's the way each of us interprets things differently. I mean, you and I could, as an exercise, but we're not going to do this, but you and I, as an exercise, could pick a song from a book or from a recording and say, right, separately, we're both going to learn this. And chances are it'll come out, they won't sound the same, because part of the beauty of it is how everyone's mind works differently and everyone's thought processes are different and everyone's approach to music making is different. And I think that's the beauty of approaching the same song. I mean, sometimes when I'm coming up with material for another album of traditional songs, I do try and keep an eye out on what's current at the moment in terms of albums that are coming out, just to make sure that if I do pick a song, I'm thinking maybe I won't I might pick a song rather and start working on it, but then realize that that another version of that song has come out on someone else's album in the same year or something. And I think, well, maybe I'll give that song a miss for another couple of years because there's already a version of that out there. But at the same time, chances are I'll be doing it completely differently from what they did.
Yeah, absolutely.
But nevertheless, you have sometimes I have to approach it from a slightly more commercial record making side of sort of angle, in which is there's a version of such and such come out this year, so maybe I'll do something different for a bit and then come back to that once the dust has settled, you know. But then again, the opposite end of it, yeah, everyone arranges things differently. That's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
So your version then, which is the Tony Rose one and the Wanton Seed. So this is the Murdered Servant Man, as opposed to Bruton Town or any of the other titles.
Yeah.
Because we were saying earlier with Steve Gardham that there are many titles for this. And in America, it tends to be things like The Cruel Brothers or The Jealous Brothers. And over here, you get Bruton Town and The Bramble Briar and things. And that A.L. Lloyd one called In Berlin Gap, which we think is some sort of shoehorning in of the idea that it's a different folk song, something to do with Lord Burlington or something. There was something there that Steve and I sort of came up with, but we can't be certain, obviously. So your version, which stems from the Tony Rose one, starts with the line, "Now a famous farmer as you shall hear." So in this version, this strand of versions, there's no location, which is so crucial to all the other versions.
Well, is it crucial? I mean, I often think that singers might well have localized it to sort of make it more relevant to their audience. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if somebody sang in Bruton Town because they came from somewhere near Bruton, and it kind of makes it more interesting. I mean, I know listening to Steve Gardham, that there's a lot of versions of this which are set in Bridgewater as well. But yeah, so
maybe not crucial, but I think so. The location normal for a lot of versions is also the title of the song, and I think part of that is it's the first line, but it's also a location. And so, but this version, this variant has no location at all.
Variant
it just doesn't bother.
It's universal.
Where there are farmers, there is.
Where there are farmers, there will be jealous sons. Yes,
and there will.
But I mean,
famous farmers.
The essential thing about this song is it's about class. It seems to me it's about two brothers who think that their sister is going to marry below her, and they don't want to see that happen. It's a class thing.
It's not an approach we would take nowadays, though. This is different times, although it obviously wasn't acceptable back then either.
Well, no, it's a bit of an extreme response, I think.
Yes, absolutely. It's yeah. I mean, even then, I don't think, you know, I if I had a sister, I certainly wouldn't murder her sweetheart purely because I didn't like him. But I wouldn't murder him at all. But I don't have a sister, so it's not an issue. But yeah, it's just, but it's storytelling, isn't it?
It is. It's all storytelling.
Yeah. And then I was talking with Steve Gardham earlier about the version that Sarah Gray sings called The Jealous Brothers. And that one, that's an American one, and that just doesn't have anything until the song starts with the brothers setting out to murder the servant man.
So the context is missing.
Yeah, it just gets rid of the context, and the first verse is, "They sat a court in one fine evening, the brothers hearing what they say. Oh, it's this courtship, it must be ended, for the likes of this will never do."
Yeah, well, yeah, okay. So the context is not completely missing, but yeah, it's not obvious. It's clearly that it's an inappropriate courtship for whatever reason. Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
And then it goes on to, "They rose up early next morning, a game of hunting for to go. Oh, it's this young man they both did flatter to go and hunt along with them." And and then you get the verse, but I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but you get this thing. Brian Peters spoke about this a few episodes ago about how bits of songs repeat themselves, partly because it works really well poetically, but also it's a way of for songs to get in their heads a bit quicker, is for repetitive bits to come in, like things like there's things in Lord Bateman like away went the proud young porter, away and away and away went he. Those kind of repetitive words or phrases. And in this version, you get this verse that turns up twice. And a lot of times, you get a verse that happens from the perspective of someone, and the same verse happens from the perspective of someone else. And so you get the brothers. They rode all over the hills and valleys in places where that they were known until they came to a lonesome valley. That's where they killed him and left him alone. And later on in the song, when she, the sister, realizes what's happened, you then get a verse. She rode over the hills and valleys in places where that she was known until she came to a lonesome valley. That's where they killed him and left him alone. It's repeated thing, which I love. Repeated things like that in songs. It can extend the song sometimes a bit, and sometimes songs do go on a bit long. But I do love repeated sections like that. But you don't get a mention of the occupation of what I mean what I mean about there's no setup and no sort of context to this is that you don't know that the victim is a servant.
No.
Until the brothers return home, and the sister, the second line in the fourth verse, the sister asked where the servant was.
Right.
And suddenly, then you're being told, you're being drip fed this information that otherwise would have been the first 2 or 3 verses, which is interesting stuff. But yeah, most versions it's all there in the first verse, isn't it? Basically, that's
yeah.
I didn't mention this. Well, I mentioned this version with Steve earlier, but I mentioned a recording of an American woman called Eliza Pace, and her first verse it's near Bridgewater, and there's a word we can't make out near the end, but it sounds like the word Arabian, because it's transcribed that near Bridgewater a rich man lived. He had 2 sons and a daughter dear, whose life by death Arabian, and filled his children's hearts with fear. Which doesn't make sense. We can't quite work that one out, but whether that's a mishearing of, because that's what it sounds like on the recording, so we've just transcribed it as such, but she's probably sang something else, but we can't make it out because of the scratchiness of the recording.
In those circumstances, I would probably think, well, what might it have been? And I would just make up a line rather than try and transcribe.
Yeah, I probably would have changed it to something else. And that's how variety comes sometimes, is that someone forgot something and made it up because they forgot.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And then somebody's come along and collected it and written it down and set it in stone.
And said, that's what they sang. Where did that come from? And probably the answer is they forgot and they came up with it on the spot because you wanted to hear me sing it.
Yes, that's right. Almost certainly. Yeah.
Anyway, we're still on the song, but we've digressed a bit. But nevertheless, I think we'll come to these some recommendations of some modern versions, some revival singer versions. I sometimes say modern, and then someone says, do we count recordings from the 1960s as modern? I mean, let's have some revival performance recommendations. Some from the folk revival as it goes on.
There's a version of Bruton Town. I mean, the first version which I would have been aware of was, though not of this particular tune or version, there is a version of Bruton Town recorded by Pentangle, and I listened to Pentangle quite a lot in my youth, and really should listen to them more again because they were really most interesting musically.
Yes, it's not a band that I've listened to much, although I will be soon because I'm working my way through. I think it was Uncut Magazine did a separate magazine called the 500 Greatest Albums of the 1960s, and I am stupidly gradually working my way through them all. And there is a couple of Pentangle albums there, I think.
They should be. They should be there.
And it might even be this one because this album, The Pentangle, the first one, was 1968, so it may
Yeah,
well be that one.
yeah, I'm sure it is. On Banks of Green Willow, of course, Tony Rose's version.
Oh yeah,
Seminal as far as I'm concerned.
that's a 1976 album. That's his third LP.
It's on. You can find it on YouTube and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Crucially, it's one of the leader trailer records, which is very difficult to get
That's
hold of.
right. Although I'd highly recommend people using Discogs to track down secondhand copies because
Of
it's
course.
highly recommended. And actual fact, yeah, that's the album that opens. The Murdered Seven Man is side one, track 5, but it's the album I think that really, as far as I'm aware, kick-started this obsession everyone has with the song "'Twas on One April Morning," which is side one, track 1, because that's the version, and everyone sings it.
Yeah, I sing it, of course, because I am no better than everyone.
I can almost wager. I'm not going to wager, but I almost wager that anyone who sings it, if you ask for the lineage of that song where they got it from, etc., I reckon it all goes back to Tony Rose. Yeah, so that's a very crucial album in a lot of the sort of current folk psyche.
Yeah, it is. Well, I think Tony holds a position quite like Nick Jones at that period. I mean, he is a source of a lot of stuff.
A lot of stuff that is still current.
That is still current.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's 1976 album, that one.
I mean, for me, those two. I mean, the four singers who I have trawled stuff out of and you reused more than anybody else. Tony Rose, Nick Jones, Chris Foster, and Dave Burland.
Oh, magic!
Those are. I mean, though of course I sing songs that have been sung by lots of other people too. The other recommendation I would make is to listen to a much more recent version of this, which is has been recorded by The Wilderness Yet.
Ah, really good band, that one. Yeah, great.
Yeah,
friends of mine in Sheffield.
Yeah, and a very nice couple. Yeah, done some work.
That's the band is Rosie Hodgson, Rowan Piggott, and Philip Barnes, and they learnt, and Rosie sings it in the band and learn it from you. So there you go.
So I believe, yes.
So I will recommend a handful as well. Last week on the podcast, we had John Looms as the singer guest for the song "The Three Butchers," and we recommended the version that Martin Carthy sang back in 1966 on his album called Second Album. And of course, Two Butchers was side 1, side A, track 1, and this song, Bruton Town, is side 2, track 1, side B. So that's quite a nice coincidence. I wonder if that was deliberate. Probably not. No, because that was 4 years before Steve Roud started doing the index. So he wasn't thinking about Roud numbers, Martin Carthy, because they didn't exist. But always highly recommend Martin Carthy if you ever recorded a version of one of these songs. Really brilliant. So Martin Carthy on Second Album for the song Bruton Town. Back in 2008, Bellowhead recorded it on their second album called Matashin. And I remember, this is apropos nothing, I saw the first ever Bellowhead performance of this song. They did a tour to promote this album, and I remember they played at Lewes Town Hall in Sussex, and they played this. I remember John Bowden announcing when they started the song that this was the debut performance of the song, so that was quite nice. But they played it there. John had learnt it from the record "Folk Songs of Old England" by Maddie Pryor and Tim Hart. So that's the version that he sings, and that's an arrangement, the Bellowhead arrangement by the trombone player, Justin Thurger. Kind of more of a sort of jazzy arrangement than what a lot of Bellowhead arrangements are, but it's a very interesting arrangement. And consequently, John Bowden included it on his A Folk Song a Day project as well, that lasted a whole year. 6th of November 2010, if anyone wants to actually track it down. And keeping it in-house, as I always do on the podcast a bit, Brian Peters recorded it on his album, Gritstone Serenade. The album's called, and that's an album from 2010, I think. And we talked about different titles of songs earlier with Steve Gardham, and Brian Peters' version is The Break of Briars. So that's one of those versions. And I think he put that one together. The words I think he got from a Kent Traveller singer, and the tune he found in a Ewan MacColl and Peggy Seeger book. So I always highly recommend Brian's versions. I mentioned her quite a lot because of the arrangement of the song, but Sarah Gray and her song that we looked a bit into, The Jealous Brothers, that was a 2009 CD called Sandy Boys on the Fellside record label. And that's an American one from Fayetteville, Arkansas, 1939 collection, I think. A couple of versions called The Bramble Briar. We've got Martin Simpson, actually named his album, one of his albums after it. So there's an album of his called The Bramble Briar on Topic Records in 2001. And that's the version that's in the Penguin Book of English Folk Songs, and subsequently recorded by Louis Killen back in 1996. And that's the one that Martin Simpson did there. And Jim Moray also recorded The Bramble Briar on his 2019 album, The Outlander, and he got that from Ewan MacColl's album, The Manchester Angel. And so Ewan MacColl turns up quite a lot on this podcast because he's in some ways, quite an important figure in a lot of the English folk scene, sort of the way things went through. But his name turns up quite a lot. So, yeah, I think that's a good comprehensive list. Pentangle's version was Bruton Town, wasn't it? I think you said.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. And then Tony Rose was Murdered Seven Man, and so was The Wilderness Yet. So that's a good range of recommendations with some title variations as well. Pentangle, Tony Rose, The Wilderness Yet, Martin Carthy, Bellowhead and John Bowden, Brian Peters, Sarah Gray, Martin Simpson, and Jim Moray. I will put links to all of those, as many as I can find, in the show notes for people to seek out and listen to and enjoy, because they should. Right, I think we'll finish there. Thanks so much for doing this. This has been marvelous.
It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, and I'm sure we'll have you back. We'll definitely try and have you back on the main podcast at some point in the future, but I definitely want to include you on the Patreon side of things, so we can include some songs from you that are much higher up the Roud index than what the main podcast will dictate. So we'll some point in the future we'll have you back for some stuff. But in the meantime, James Patterson, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt, and I look forward to seeing you. Take care. A famous farmer, as you shall hear, he had 2 sons and 1 daughter dear. Her servant man she most admired, none in the world she loved so dear. Said one brother to the other, see how our sister means to wed. Let all such courtship now be ended, we'll hoist him to some silent grave. When they returned from the field of hunting, she began to inquire for her servant man. Come, brothers, tell me, because you whisper, come, brothers, tell me if you can. Sister, we are so much amazed to see you looking so much at we. We met him where we were a-hunting, no more of him than did we see. As she lay musing all on her pillow, she dreamt she saw her true love stand by her bedside. He stood lamenting, all covered with some bloody wound. Nancy dear, don't you weep for me. Nancy dear, don't weep nor pine. In that creek where there is no water, go there you will my body find. So she rose early the very next morning, with many a sigh and a bitter groan. In that creek where her true love told her, it's there she found his body thrown. The blood all on his lips was drying, his tears were salter than any brine. And then she's kissed him, loudly crying, here lies a bosom friend of mine. 3 days and nights she stayed lamenting, till her poor heart was filled with woe, until sharp hunger came creeping on her, and homeward she was forced to go. Sister, we are so much amazed to see you looking so pale and wan. Brothers, I know you know the reason, and for the same you shall be hung. These 2 brothers both were taken, bound all down in prison strong. They both were tried, found out as guilty, and for the same they both were hung.
That was James Patterson singing The Murdered Servant Man. That brings us to the end of this episode. What did you think? What are your thoughts on the song? I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to drop me an email at intheroud@singyonder.co.uk or visit the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Blue Sky. Just search for In the Roud, a folk song podcast. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd very much appreciate it if you would just take a minute or two and give us a little rating and review on wherever you get your podcasts from. That really helps us to reach a wider audience. If you'd like to support the podcast in a financial manner, you now can. In the Roud has a Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/intheroud, and for either £5 or £10 per month subscription in support of the podcast, you will receive weekly bonus episodes, mainly focusing on other songs from further on in the Roud Index, but also episodes on other areas of folk song, including collectors and singers. So far, we've had a 3-episode Singer's Choice mini-season with special guest Nancy Kerr, and a collector spotlight episode with Martin Graeber looking at the life and collecting work of Sabin Baring-Gould. We're now in the middle of a mini-season devoted to traditional and local carols. So far, we've had Ian Russell giving us an introduction episode and a whole episode on While Shepherds Watched Their Flocks by Night. This week, I'm joined by my Culverake bandmate Seb Stone to chat about his own local Derbyshire carolling tradition in Great Hucklow, and to discuss the song labelled Roud 8365. That's the South Yorkshire and Derbyshire carol called Star of Bethlehem. Hear this and more at patreon.com/intheroud. One last huge thanks to this week's guests, Steve Gardham and James Patterson. Join me next week for episode 9. We'll be looking at Roud 19, which is the song The Nobleman and the Thresherman. My historical guest will be Vic Gammon, and my singer guest will be a duo, Vic Shepherd and John Bowden. Until then, that's it from me. Stay safe, be well, and I'll see you next time in the Roud.